Good morning, everyone. My name is Bonnie Wennerstrom, Policy Connector at the Washington State Healthcare Authority. I will be your Master of Ceremonies for the next 3 days. I am honored and so excited to welcome you to the 2021 Healthcare Authority and Accountable Community of Health Learning Symposium, Advancing Health Through Community Partnership. Over the next 3 days, we hope to share learnings from across the state, to highlight ACH and community partnerships, and to challenge ourselves to do more to elevate community voice and partnership. This is our 4th annual Learning Symposium event and our 2nd virtual one. As such, I want to acknowledge the stress that COVID-19 has continued to place on Washingtonians and communities across the state. We are so glad that you're able to be here with us. We'll start today with a land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that I am speaking to you from Olympia. These lands were shared by the tribes we know today as the Cowlitz Indian Tribe, the Squaxin Island Tribe, and the Nisqually Indian Tribe. I honor and thank their ancestors and leaders who have been stewards of these lands and waters since time immemorial. And I commit to caring for the land and waters, plants, and animals. We are meeting virtually today across Washington State, including participants from across the nation. The lands we are on are the traditional territories of hundreds of indigenous nations, some with names that have been lost to history, and others with names we recognize today. Many of us are employees of the state of Washington and thus guided by the Centennial Accord and Chapter 43.376 RCW. Respecting and affirming tribal sovereignty, working with our tribal governments throughout the state in government-to-government partnership. We strive to work with our tribal and Indian health partners to improve the lives of Indigenous people, their non-Indigenous family members, and neighbors throughout the state. Thank you. So now I'll talk about some Zoom housekeeping. So the audience, that's you, is muted and your video cameras are turned off. You should only see the panelists and the slides when they are shown. If you have technology issues, please put those into the chat. There's only the option to chat the panelists, not the entire audience. Our tech folks will see your chats to the panelists and get back to you individually, also via the chat. If you have questions for our speakers and panelists during the sessions, please use the Q&A box for those. We'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible. Both the chat and the Q&A function are at the bottom of your screen. We are recording all of the sessions, and copies of all of the slides and materials will be available on the ACH website after the 3rd day of the symposium. That's www.washingtonach.org. And now I'm going to hand it over to our Healthcare Authority Director, Sue Birch, for some opening remarks. Sue, please go ahead.
Good morning. I'm going to do a quick sound check. Great. I think you got me.
We can hear you.
Great. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 2021 HCA and ACH Learning Symposium. It is really wonderful to be here with all of you. It's a little drizzly in Olympia, but it's going to be a great day and a great event. I am really excited about our keynote speakers and the panelists this year. There's going to be so much information that is very powerful and will help us as we mature along our journey in all of our ACH work together. Over the next 3 days, you'll be hearing about the work ACHs do in partnership with their communities. Over the last 5 years, ACHs have played a unique role in our state's journey to a healthier Washington. Each ACH is unique, but they share a common approach to improving the health of their communities and transformation of healthcare delivery. And many of you know I'm a nurse, and that's really how we go about healthcare. Each person is unique, but we have to cater and make it person-centered, and it's beautiful that our ACHs are working with their regions and their locales in a very individual way. ACHs work to solve complicated problems through cross-sector collaborations and investments in innovative approaches. ACHs are leading efforts to transform our local healthcare systems. They've helped connect healthcare and social services. They've developed plans to support health across sectors, and they've invested millions of dollars into providers and community partners. That's no small feat in this changing healthcare landscape. It's really exciting that they are building up a lot more uniformity and evenness in our community-based organizations. ACHs will continue to help us move to whole person integrated and value-based system. And I remind you guys that that's not new, that's what we've been doing, but we have to go deeper into this work and getting that uniformity and getting community-based organizations to be more similar, but yet kind of unique to each region is no small feat. As some of you know, HCA is working on a renewal of its Medicaid waiver. ACHs are going to continue to be an important part of our strategy moving forward. So that's exciting that we have an administration at the national level now that is eager for us to continue our journey in population health and all of our ACH work together. We absolutely are seen nationally as a pace setter, and we can't thank you enough for your partnership. So over the next 3 days, please attend as many of these sessions as you can. There's so much to hear about. We hope you're going to walk away over these 3 days having learned about important work happening all over the state. And again, from everybody here at HCA in our virtual worlds, we can't thank you enough for being our steadfast partners during the pandemic and through our entire healthcare transformation journey. Let's have a great event. Bonnie, back to you.
Thanks so much, Sue. Carol, please go ahead for introducing our keynote speaker.
Great. Thanks, Bonnie. Good morning. I'm Carol Moser, Executive Director of the Greater Columbia Accountable Community of Health. And on behalf of Washington's 9 ACHs, I want to welcome you to the HCA ACH 2021 Learning Symposium. I know I'm speaking for my ACH colleagues when I say we are extremely excited about our keynote speakers and panelists. Over the next 3 days, you'll be hearing about the work ACHs do in partnership with our communities. For the most part, you won't be hearing from ACH staff. You'll be hearing from community partners, on-the-ground providers, and community-based organizations. We are honored to work alongside them as we work towards health and well-being for all Washingtonians. And now I'd like to introduce our opening keynote speaker, Soma Saha. Soma Saha, a Baha'i, has spent over 25 years working to grow thriving people and communities in some of the poorest places in the world. A primary care doctor and public health professional, Soma is founder and executive lead of Wellbeing and Equity in the World, We in the World, as well as executive lead of the Wellbeing in the Nation, WIN Network, which work together to advance intergenerational well-being and equity. Over the past 5 years, Soma has been the vice president at the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. Dr. Saha founded and led 100 Million Healthier Lives, which brought together more than 850 partners in over 30 countries, reaching more than 500 million people to improve health, well-being, and equity. In 2012, Dr. Saha was recognized as one of 10 inaugural Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Young Leader Awardees under 40 for significant contributions to improving the health of the nation. She has consulted with leaders from across the world, including Guyana, Sweden, the United Kingdom, Singapore, Australia, Tunisia, Denmark, and Brazil. She's appeared on a panel with the Dalai Lama, keynoted conferences around the world, and has had her work featured on Sanjay Gupta, The Katie Couric Show, PBS, and CNN. In 2016, she was elected as a Leading Causes of Life Global Fellow. We are so lucky to have you this morning, Soma. We're very excited to hear your presentation, and I turn the program now over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moser. It's such a privilege to be with all of you today. You know, I think in this moment in time that I think of as a generational moment in time, when this moment is pregnant with possibility from a pandemic, a racial reckoning, and a pivot that we have the opportunity to make. This is a moment where across the world, people are asking, who will we choose to be to one another? And that's the conversation that I'd love to welcome each of you into as you think about your work as accountable communities for health. We're pioneering in many ways for the whole nation what it can look like to lean into this moment of transformation to both equitably meet the needs of communities today, but more importantly, to build the systems that liberate them to meet their own needs in the future. Let's talk a little bit about what that looks like. As we think about that, I'm going to invite you all to think with me about two boys who I think a lot about when I do my work. Let's call the one on the left Sean and the one on the right Thomas. Now, these are two real kids. They happen to be growing up in Cleveland. They were best friends in kindergarten, and they got their dads one morning to take them to the barber shop because they were convinced that if they shaved their heads, they could run pranks on their kindergarten teacher by making her believe they were interchangeable. I always say it's one of those documented cases that racism is an acquired disease. But what we know, as we've all in a critical mass come to recognize that structural racism, colonialism, and other inequities are the endemic disease underlying this pandemic, what we know is that these two boys could be born in the same hospital, grow just 2 miles apart, and have as much as a 20-year gap in their life expectancy. One might have the life expectancy as if they were growing up in Sweden, one of the highest in the world, and one might have the life expectancy as if they were growing up in Nigeria or in Kazakhstan, one of the lowest in the world. And understanding that that life expectancy is predictable at birth for these two kids, I think forces us to begin to ask, knowing that these kinds of maps, which Robert Wood Johnson Foundation helped to popularize with VCU over a decade ago now, that our zip code matters more than our genetic code, I think challenges all of us in this moment to say, what would it take for us to create a world where Sean and Thomas are running pranks on their partners and their children at their ripe old age of 80 together, rather than the current situation where Thomas is likely to not survive to see his grandkids graduate. He's likely to not leave more than $8 in wealth for his son and daughters and children to ride out the pandemic. When we understand that we have a system of structural racism, colonialism, and residential segregation, it invites us to ask, where is that showing up? Now, we know some of where that shows up. If we look at our data, we can see that maps across the country of, on the left-hand side, childhood economic hardship, on the right-hand side of childhood obesity, look remarkably similar. If you fast forward the map on the right by 30 years, you get a map of premature diabetes. In another 10 years, that's a map of your high-risk, high-cost people that we're trying to manage, perhaps in some of your value-based programs. And then in another 10 years, it's a very map of the inequitable life expectancy outcomes that we see for these two kids. And I think if we begin to understand that we could draw these maps, not just of childhood obesity, but if you look at the social vulnerability or other index, we begin to get a narrative about race, place, health, and wealth that has been inextricably inextricably combined since the beginning of our nation. That we, in fact, exist with systems of, in this case, we describe systems of redlining, et cetera, but of residential segregation, of putting people in land that's poorer in reservations, of separation, that at its core, at its root, needs to be corrected if we're going to have a different outcomes. And we see this in understanding that this fundamental recognition that the well-being of people, of individuals and groups of people, that the well-being of places and their vital conditions of those places, and that the systems driving inequity are fundamentally interconnected, that there are these policies and investments and systems that are legacies that we've inherited that perpetuate inequitable outcomes. And as we've seen, as you've seen in Washington State, that the social vulnerability maps and COVID cases look remarkably similar. This is from your Department of Health website. And that those maps play out throughout Chicago. The right-hand side here is a map of outside of Chicago, and then this on the left-hand side is a map of COVID cases, and the green dots are the deaths. The CDC in 2016 could predict who would be vulnerable to the next pandemic. And while today we're talking about COVID-19, the same will be true for climate disasters and for a whole host of other shocks and stressors to the system. But those who have less, those who structurally by legacies have been set up to have less, are likely to do worse. What we also have to recognize in this generational moment, that the choices we make as leaders matter. If we don't apply an equity first approach to our response, we are likely to end up complicit inadvertently to our generation's episode of redlining. What you see on the left-hand side, and also in Chicago, is case rates of COVID per 100,000. You see it's much more dense in the west side of Chicago, but the number of paycheck protection loans in our largest benefit programs and even of vaccinations go to the upper right-hand side, to the Northeast. And I think if we don't understand the implications of that for generational wealth, not just because of direct resources, but because of who lives and who dies, who experiences long COVID and lives with that as a chronic disability, what we have to recognize is today we're either going to correct these maps or we're going to redraw and reinforce those inequities. It's a generational moment that calls all of us who are serious about creating the conditions for everyone to thrive together, to say, how do we do that in a way that's focused, in a way that's strategic, in a way that's impactful, and above all, in a way that grows and unleashes the trapped and untapped potential of those whose ability to contribute to their own health and well-being and those of others has been held back. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. I invite us to think about what love looks like in this moment for you in Washington County, and what it means for you to begin to step into your own power and privilege and your ability to look at this response in a way that truly demands a different outcome for people. So as we think about that, I'm going to invite you to know that you are not alone, that you're pioneers, and many of you, much of this conference will be about what you're doing, knowing that you come from a deep recognition of these underlying legacies, what you're already doing. And what I want to tell you is that as pioneers, you are joined by hundreds of others of communities across the nation that are leaning into this moment to acknowledge and change the culture and systems and policies that perpetuate legacies of exclusion to ones which create dignity and inclusion, and to create the vital conditions that all of us need to thrive. So what are those vital conditions? Well, we didn't define them, we asked you. We asked thousands of community residents across the country in the WIN network. And as we did that, it turned out that what mattered the most was a sense of belonging and civic muscle, belonging to one another, belonging to the earth, belonging to our culture, belonging to our greater world. And that if we could create equitable belonging and civic muscle, all of the rest of these that we sometimes call social determinants, our basic needs for health and safety, access to lifelong learning, meaningful work and wealth, humane housing, reliable transportation, a thriving natural world, these are not things that poor people need. These are things all of us need to thrive. What we need to think about is how we might be able to create some of the conditions for thriving together across Washington State. So as we think about that, I'm going to invite you to lean into to explore with me a theory of change that starts by saying, what if we could begin by understanding the legacies for living together that got us here? Some of dignity and inclusion, and many others of trauma and exclusion, which means that some people reliably have all of the vital conditions they need, and other people exist in conditions of adversity and urgent needs. And as a result, we built a whole economy that we sometimes think of as an adversity economy that rewards those who are taking care of people who need help immediately, but continues to perpetuate a system where many people are left out, where they don't have the affordable housing, the access to meaningful work and wealth, and other conditions that they might need to thrive. As we think about that, if we're truly to create the conditions for more people to be thriving and fewer people to be struggling and suffering, and part of what we need to begin to do is to say, what does it look like for us to shift things from the bottom to the top? And so from response and to resilience, and ultimately in acknowledgement of those legacies to come together in relationship to chart a path toward renewal. Renewal that doesn't require us to rescue people, but understands that people are whole. And what they need is what we need to do is to restore the relationships with ourselves, with one another, and with the earth that are required to create the conditions for people to be thriving. What does that look like? Well, I'm going to share a few examples with you as we think about this together. In the south of Texas, they've been calling this about going from charity to equity to liberation. Methodist Healthcare Ministries looked back as a steward about over its 25 years of investing in the south of Texas to address health. And what they learned was, while they had done many good things in meeting people's physical and mental health, they hadn't moved the needle. And what they didn't want to do in this generational moment, as they thought about their next 25 years, was to look back in another 25 years and realize that they hadn't moved the needle then. What they realized is that they were doing things like invest in primary care clinics to improve the mental and physical health of people. They had even begun to screen for and address people's social needs, and to understand and connect people to those social needs, and to think about their spiritual well-being. What they hadn't done is strategically invest in improving the vital conditions in communities or to address root causes. So as they began to think about that, they began saying, what does a more balanced set of investments look like that would help us to do that? This is a Pathways to Population Health model. First, they looked at their data. They mapped out and saw it was this bottom third of Texas on the left-hand side that happened to have a greater proportion of poor health outcomes, COVID cases, unemployment, and need. And so first thing they did from a targeted universalism approach is say, we're going to create the conditions for everyone to thrive. And so we need to focus and have additional supports where people are most not thriving, where they have the longest to go. They actually did system mapping and we built simulations for them. And what they found after as they talked to stakeholders and actually modeled what it would take to move health, well-being, and equity in their region, what they learned was that investments in primary care, those things mattered. They would make a difference. But those were dwarfed by things like this was done in 2019, investments in broadband, architecture in the places that didn't have internet access, and investments in that case, the census count, which then drives social determinant investments across. And suddenly they realized that, wait, this wasn't about healthcare solving the problem alone. This was about recognizing that they needed to be part of an ecosystem that was co-investing in creating those vital conditions. So they went and began looking for partners. And as they did that, they found them at every place they looked. In communities, there were community residents and others who had experienced great inequities, who told them, hey, rather than make a stand in line for food and supporting, yes, build a capacity of food banks and faith communities and others to distribute healthy food, but maybe think about how you create a sustainable food economy that invests in local farmers to be able to grow healthy food and provide it for their region, creating health and wealth together. They understood that they needed to invest in civic capacity and made primary investments. It's targeted toward those communities that were the farthest behind, with community residents experiencing inequities as a part of it, to then say, what are the policies that we need to invest in? And what they learned for community residents as they were constantly trying to emerge out of poverty, but couldn't because of fiscal cliffs. And so they made a balanced set of investments in policy changes, created a fund that families could propose their own solutions for their lives to, that improves 2-generational educational outcomes by 88%, while reducing dependence on public goods by improving family wealth. And ultimately, they began investing in a 5G ring together with the Federal Reserve, the FCC, and others in the poorest place in the colonias at the border, to build an economic pipeline where people could have jobs and health and wealth together. They greenlined what had been redlined. And this shows some of those outcomes from the Family Independence Initiative, where families could choose their own outcomes in a liberatory model of what investing in equity could look like. And then across the nation, the story of Texas, where people in Crystal City, Texas, the birthplace of Cesar Chavez's Si Se Puede movement, where youth stood up and said, we won't accept racism in our schools. And the city experienced a massive disinvestment over time, with receiving only 3/4 of their resources that the rest of the state receives per child, for example. In an economic devastation that followed, part of what they're doing in this moment of COVID is, yes, they're vaccinating people, they're assuring health and well-being, but they're reclaiming the narrative and helping people understand the legacies that got us here. Across the country, through RISE, communities are learning that you can't change the future without acknowledging the past. But if you acknowledge the past together, they can build trust, deepen civic capacity, and transform systems to build new legacies for their children and grandchildren. And as they've done that, this has required us to enter into an unprecedented level of collaboration with groups that don't traditionally work together, like Meals on Wheels and US Aging and N4A, working with groups like Chromatic Black and the Migrant Clinicians Network and N4A. And as they've begun to do that, what they found is, by putting their assets together, as I hope you will do in Washington State, in your accountable communities for health, what they're able to do is not only meet people's immediate needs in a whole person way today, with in the last 3 months, over 18.5 million people reached, people vaccinated who are in communities of color, 200 communities mobilized, over nearly 47,000 people connected to social needs. But what they're doing is building regions that are multi-solving for health, well-being, and equity. It's older adult organizations learning that they can, through migrant worker organizations, reach older migrant workers. And it's migrant worker organizations saying the way to do that is through radio while people are working in the fields because they don't have enough broadband or texting plans or smartphones to be able to be reached in other ways. It's communities holding events that, such as one in North Carolina later this week, that will include vaccine pop-up clinics with food distribution, with grown in local farms in a way that creates wealth in those farms by Black farmers to tenant rights organizations to address immediate needs around eviction and expungement clinics, all being done at the same site that restores people's civic rights and transforms them from criminals to citizens, from small fees and fines that are holding back their records. And then finally, they're changing the narrative about who people are, that these are not poor and broken people. These are people who are our future community leaders, that this isn't about vaccine resistance and hesitancy. It's about keeping Black love alive, about keeping love alive. And I think by shifting the narrative, by restoring culture, as they're doing in Ocetiwakan in Pine Ridge, founded by P. Escachas, a senior which stands for He Walks with Hot Coals, a 37-generation Lakota medicine man who's leaning in, whose organization Ocetiwakan is restoring Indigenous culture and conception of mental, physical, social, and spiritual well-being in K-12 schools in Pine Ridge. Now, these might seem far for many of you who have a traditional health frame, but friends, if you look at the deep trauma and mental dissonance that's created when people aren't restored to a whole connection to their identity, what we're learning is that people's health and well-being aren't just what we measure in the blood, something we've known, but that these primary investments in restoring culture, in restoring wealth to those places that have been redlined, in restoring possibility, and in trusting those who experience inequities to be the greatest source of abundance that our nation knows, that what we're doing is building a new legacy of thriving together, that we have the opportunity today to make pivotal moves that can shape us for a generation. And not only are we doing that at the local level, across 26 federal agencies, there's a federal plan emerging that's aligning around these vital conditions. This is a plan that crosses administrations and is led by the civil servant leaders at the highest level that are not political appointees in 26 agencies that are saying, you know, what would it take for us not to ask people to change, but for us to change, to chart a path toward long-term recovery and resilience. As I wrap up today, I leave you with this poem and a question. What legacy will you risk your significance to create? Donna Markova writes, I will not die an unlived life. I will not live in fear of falling or catching fire. I choose to inhabit my days, to allow my living to open me, to make me less afraid, more accessible, to loosen my heart until it becomes a wing, a torch, a promise. I choose to risk my significance, to live so that which came to me as seed goes to the next as blossom, and that which came to me as a blossom goes on as fruit. For any of you who went into healthcare as I did, as a primary care physician, thinking that this is what we would do for our patients, I invite each of us to lean in to what we do for not only for our patients, but for our system, our society as the patient. Our society is ill because we have been separated from one another. And as we lean into this moment, I invite you to consider that it's in reconnecting along our belonging and civic muscle, in reconnecting ourselves to ourselves, in restoring ourselves to one another, in restoring ourselves to the earth, and in following that up, not as just in a spiritual way, but in a strategic way, we have the opportunity to build a legacy that we can be proud to be a part of, one that we're proud to leave to our children and grandchildren. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Soma, for your inspiring message and words. We do have some questions from the audience that would love for you to respond to. So the first question is, can you talk about how COVID-19 and the changes that came with it as a result of the pandemic can help in the revival and redevelopment of an equal and high-level public healthcare system?
Absolutely. There are so many incredible ways to do that. I think, and I can connect you with some resource. There are some resources I've linked in that talk about more specifically about the why. But one of the biggest opportunities is that idea of greenlining what was redlined. An equity first approach would say, how can we invest in the places that have been hardest hit today and hardest hit historically, with living wage jobs for example, a community-based workforce. I see the question in the chat about that, of community health workers that aren't just around COVID testing and response, but who we see as part of what we've always needed, that other countries have always invested in as a primary health and well-being system that can meet people's needs more holistically, such as they're doing in North Carolina and other places, to understand their mental, physical, social, and spiritual well-being, and not just connect people to resources, but be part of those who are saying what is needed to change those underlying inequities in these communities. A second is to use the data that comes from that to say, what are those underlying inequities? We actually could just look at past data as well. We have, our issue isn't the presence of data or lack of data. Our issue is doing something with the data. So strategically investing in those places to restore the vital conditions, and above all, to understand that and reconcile our history of inequity, of colonialism and racism and other economic inequities, of urban-rural divides that have shaped the conditions that exist today, and that offer us the opportunity to say you can't change, you can't address a problem if you don't acknowledge a problem. So we need to just be okay with reconciling ourselves with our history, just as Germany did after Nazi Germany, and began to create a very different narrative. I'm not saying we were Nazi Germany, but our acceptance of inequity as a norm is something that I think we have to reconcile with and build very different legacies for in the future.
Thank you. Another question, Soma, what are some of the most effective ways to engage our communities and get input on addressing their challenges, especially in their communities?
I think that communities have gotten asked over and over again, but often they don't know whether their voice actually matters. So what we've done is say, let's do that engagement, but let's actually create a real plan for transforming that voice into policy and systems change, into investment change. And in doing that, let's reach communities through trusted messengers. In our case, you saw that network. So it's people who are migrant workers who are reaching out to other migrant workers, and by investing directly in those organizations rather than ourselves, trusting them to lead, and having them then help shape, actually playing a leadership role in shaping the outcome that comes from it, rather than they're doing something for us, which we then decide what happens. I think we have to be willing to share power if we are interested in being really equitable, not just because it's the right thing to do, but in our experience, it gets people much more efficiently to effective outcomes.
Great. Another one from the chat. Christina writes, I saw the GI Bill on the housing inequality slide. Can you please share how earned military benefits contribute to housing inequity as a whole? Inequality.
Yeah, actually, Black, Indigenous, and other servicemen were not equally given access to those benefits from the GI Bill. They were specifically excluded, and that was part of how they weren't able to benefit from many of the benefits that came from that.
Thank you. Soma, how would you describe the relationship between social determinants of health and equity and anti-racism?
Thank you so much for asking that question. It's one of my favorites. So I always think of it as a tree. So the leaves and fruits of the tree might be our health outcomes that we see, and we can see inequities in those, and there are things we can do to mitigate those. The social determinants or vital conditions are maybe the trunk of the tree. That's how those are being manifest in terms of the conditions that are in our communities, which then lead to those social needs, which then lead to poor health outcomes, right? So those are related. But the root causes, the roots of the tree are things like racism, classism, sexism, colonialism, immigrant discrimination, things like that, gender discrimination. I mean, there's a whole range of ways in which we have structurally kept people out and have done so over, in many cases, hundreds of years, that then lead to inequitable vital conditions in communities. In particular, because we've had a strong history of residential segregation, and because so many of our policies, unlike actually many other countries, we keep taxes local as just one example. And that actually reinforces a system of residential segregation, because we don't believe we belong to each other. Other countries say we would never choose to do that, because that will immediately lead to discrimination and inequity in the distribution of resources. Great.
We talked a little bit about community health workers. Could you please speak to the role and the importance and the value of having a community-based workforce system to address our disease and particularly separation from one another?
I think community health workers are, and a community-based workforce in general has been a missing element of our primary health and well-being system. I think this is a moment to invest in a community-based workforce, that because, for those of you who have created high-functioning teams, you know that your medical assistant and your receptionist may be closest to understanding what's actually happening for people. And for those who are actually able to, in a place-based way, know their neighbors, know what's going on in a neighborhood, if we can not just help invest in that as a group of people that can meet people's health conditions and well-being needs, but we're willing to invite their voice at the table about what's going on in the underlying conditions of communities to help guide our investments and policies, my guess is we would get to far better outcomes sooner. That's a major part of what we've chosen to invest in RISE. Over the last 6 months, we've moved millions of dollars from HRSA and CDC funds directly to community-based workforces, and then invited those who are closest to the problem to help lead the solutions. And that's, I think, where there's any success in our outcomes, it's because of that, and then the systemic lens from that.
Thank you. So how can clinical purchasers like the Healthcare Authority invest upstream without medicalizing social services or duplicating work that should be better led by others?
That's a fantastic question, and I'm so grateful to you for asking that. So upstream investment is there's a couple of pieces. One is, instead of setting the table, there's usually tables that have been set a long time ago. Pull up a chair and say, hey, what can we do to help? and then do the things that communities are telling us that we need to do. For addressing social needs, that might mean investing in the civic infrastructure and in the infrastructure of community-based organizations that are providing human services. But I think the other opportunity we have is to address it even further upstream, to stand with our colleagues in affordable housing to say, we don't have enough housing, and this is what's causing in our health outcomes. And yes, we're willing to invest, but we shouldn't be the only people, and we need you to build a long-term strategy toward sufficient affordable housing in our communities, that people don't go bankrupt for either housing or healthcare. The second piece of that is, understanding and speaking to things that are outside what we know, but have huge opportunities and impacts. So there's a revolving door between jails, social services, and emergency rooms for people with mental health and addictions. Really understanding and seeing that as a system, speaking against policies that incarcerate and transforming that into funding, not along a justice pathway that often just leads to racial injustice, and instead a recovery, healing pathway that leads to growth by investing in social services, investing in community-based mental health, investing in food and housing for those who are caught in that revolving door. Those are examples of things that in Delaware, for example, showed dramatic improvements in both measurable improvements in people suffering, from 25% down to 7% in 6 months of the pandemic. But over the year, reduced overdose rates from 23% increase nationwide to 3.6%. These are real changes with real outcomes that can happen in real time if we're able to see what I call the invisible in our plateaus. These are not intractable problems. They're just misdiagnosed ones. And if we can get closer to addressing them at the root, we much more effective and invest in those solutions, even if they're outside the boundary of usual healthcare as we know it. This is where using the waiver, as you've done in Washington State so well, as one example of really trying out new ways to invest, can be really helpful.
Make sure we take that message back to our clinical partners. So here's something in the chat. Hi, Soma, Sterling Maharaj Lewis here. My question surrounds youth engagement as we move forward in our co-creation activities. My example would be that the Washington State House bill that mandates comprehensive sexual health care education in schools, and it makes me think about how are we inviting youth to co-create rather than prescribe what and how they should think, especially in access to and experience with sexual health care and services.
It not only in that area, absolutely, youth are actually far better educated, usually via TikTok, than anything that we've provided for them. But what I will tell you beyond sexual health is across the world, as somebody who had the privilege of being at the vantage point of 100 million, and now in our work at Wellbeing We in the World, what we've saw over and over again is that youth are more clear-eyed in what's possible. They don't have the same barriers we do. And if we're looking to build legacies for the future, we need to let those who are leaders in the future help inform, not just inform, but really lead to those legacies. And when we do that, if we don't ask, well, if we don't say we can't, and instead flip our stance to how might we make possible, we've seen youth who are leading in the process help reduce homelessness by 50% in 6 months of other youth who seen double-digit improvements in food access or educational outcomes. We have, unfortunately, because we're all trapped in these systems that tell us that these things can't change, we are caught in a false trap of impossibility. And I think youth aren't caught in that yet. And we need their vision to help us understand that this is in fact a false narrative, that in fact they can own that narrative of possibility.
And I've so appreciated in the WIN network the number of young leaders that you have guiding some of these conversations. So I don't know how you get them, but they have been very inspiring. So talking about power, how do we have conversations about power and communicating that we can move beyond a scarcity mentality of power, that my power and your power are not mutually exclusive?
You guys ask the best questions. So this idea of a zero-sum game is yet another false narrative. There are so many other kinds of power than positional power. The power to live one's life in a way that's whole, the power to give to one another and receive from one another, the power to be part of creating a future. And I think we overvalue positional power in their current society and deeply undervalue what it means for us to hold, not just hold power together, but to then use that power to create something more together. And I think, Parker Palmer said that abundance doesn't come from a belief about scarcity and holding it closely to oneself. It comes when we recognize that as we invest in community, there's more that's possible than was there before. And I think part of the mindset we have to get to is recognize, begin to believe in that and get some experience with that. I think sharing power concretely is hard, and it's hard to even have conversations about that. But there are tools like the racial equity map or the community transformation map that can serve as third things for people to reflect on power, to reflect on how how power is made manifest in your community process, and to then have a dialogue together about where things are or aren't equitable, and what it looks like for things to be more equitable together.
It reminds me of an old saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So I love that sharing of power idea. Another question, cross-sector work is so important to address equity in community. Who do you think is usually missing from cross-sector tables?
Oh gosh, it depends who's setting the table. Our issue is that we are so siloed, but I want to invite all of us to think about community residents experiencing inequities as a sector. Like if you were missing community residents experiencing inequities, you are missing a whole sector that's critical. Often we don't engage well with people in economic development or in housing or in housing. I think healthcare has begun to build more of a relationship with, but there are many sectors we tend to know the people who we're proximate with and we engage them. But part of what we need to think about, and this sort of gets back to the youth question or others, is first, let's map what systems are interacting. Let's look at the stories of people in our communities who experience inequities to actually map the system. And then let's engage those who have a role to play in that. In the state of Delaware, that recognizing the challenge that we had, what they realized was that it was youth were dropping out at the age of 12 to 13 because of school disciplinary policies, and that schools needed to be engaged to prevent that. But in addition to that, it was youth in the foster care and juvenile detention system. And often those sectors are never engaged as part of the solutions. And as they began to build that table together, they used the lives of every youth graduating past 18 who are going to experience a major drop in services to actually map out what would it take to create the conditions for well-being for this youth in a holistic way, and then looked at their policies and saw what it would take to change that, with Medicaid around the table and social services and others. And using each youth, they either created policy exceptions or a workaround, and then they systematized that. And I think sometimes system change is it seems super challenging when we think it's about them. We rarely realize a lot of time it's about us. And by setting the table based on who's needed to solve the challenge, we can find who's missing, especially those who are experiencing inequities.
Well, we could go on and on, Soma, but I guess we'd like to hear some final words of wisdom in the last few moments of your keynote.
I would love to see Washington State really show what's possible when we accept what I feel like we all kind of know at this point. We've come to realize and set aside. We've tried a world where we can't be brave, and we call it maybe being practical, but there's nothing practical about doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a better outcome. That's just called insanity. And so instead, I invite us to think about being bold and courageous and recognize that sometimes that's actually the most practical way forward, is to recognize we're on the wrong, like where we've gone off the wrong path, even historically and today, and what it looks like to course correct and lean in together from a place of possibility to build what's needed. And I invite you to do that in practical ways. What would it look like to interrupt the incarceration cycle by 50%? What would it take to reduce overdose rates by 50%? What would it take for youth to be assured of their well-being? Work backward from the aspiration. Align your stewardship and your assets and your resources to do what's needed. And that, my friends, I think is what sharing of, not just sharing of power, but the giving of power in service of love that Martin Luther King talked about is really all about.
Thank you so much to Soma Saha. It's been a great start to our learning symposium. It's put on our thinking caps and helped us, learn a little bit more about belonging and inclusion, how to shift power, how to incorporate others in our work. We are now going to take a 15-minute break before our first panel focused on community voices. So we will see you back at 9:45. Thank you.